The Red Motel, Chapter 1. Molly sat in silence for the remainder of the car ride, along the outskirts on a country road and down the barren hills of open land. Coming off the highway, they submitted to an isolated road, cracked and serrated as though the vehicle might smash right through. She stared past her own reflection in the passenger window and lulled into a daydream with her steady thoughts of dead grass and cloudless sky. Every once in a while she would be shaken from her meditation by a stabbing thought of pain, like a rush of adrenaline in her heart. What followed that was a sinking experience of sadness, which had the potential to drag Molly through her passenger seat and into a darker void, yawning just below her feet. In these moments she thought sporadically of her father, dying in a hospital bed a few towns over. She wondered if she could make it in time. Some 7 hours into the road trip, they had another 50 miles ahead of them. Would he even be conscious to receive her? It frightened her to think about confronting her father at the end of his life, but Sam had insisted she pay her last respects. Sam rolled his eyes away from the road to watch his wife, sitting slumped in her seat with her arms crossed and her breathing ragged. "You must know this area pretty well," Sam told her. "Anything around here worth seeing?" "Just farmland," Molly replied dryly. "No carnivals or museums? Maybe tourist traps, like the world's largest hammer and nails?" He attempted to solicit a smile, but she had already transitioned back to her thoughts. Sam sighed and turned up the static on the talk radio station, already slipping out of continuity. Every radio station he settled on died an hour later, and he took his hand off the wheel to tune the knob on the radio. The car bumped against something in the road, and they heard a surprising explosion, like a gun shot to cause them to seize against their seats, their belts biting into their collarbones. They had a flat tire, and cursing under his breath, Sam pulled off to the side of the road with the shredded rubber knocking on the wheel well. They both got out and inspected the tire, and to make matters worse, they seemed to be the only individuals on this particular road. "What the hell caused it?" Molly threw her arms in the air in a sign of defeat. Although she was relieved the deathbed reunion with her father was momentarily postponed, she checked her watch and felt her heart skip into rapid succession. It was already getting late. She wanted to find a hotel somewhere in town to leave their stuff before they proceeded to the hospital. Since she didn't know how long they were going to be, it would be nice to have a hotel already in line, one that they could return to without worry, even at the early hours of the morning if they had to. Sam traced the tire treads back to the scene of the accident and found a spike strip coil, like something a police officer would use. It didn't look like it was strung deliberately across the road. Only a small portion of it was actually in the street, and the rest was bunched up in a useless bundle in the gully on the left-hand side. Sam had to have veered slightly across the white guard line at just the right moment, when he was fiddling with the radio, to damage his tire. Molly stepped up next to him and cursed. "What kind of moron leaves this in the middle of the road? It could have killed someone." Sam took out his cell phone and looked up a number for roadside service. "We don't have time for that," Molly said, noting the phone in his hand. "Can't you change the tire yourself?" He communicated to her a cold look. "I've never changed a tire in my life. You won't even let me look at the plumbing in the house, and now you trust me with this? I'm honored." She slapped her hands against her thighs. As Sam dialed the phone, she looked at the spike strip in the road. It did look like it was placed there haphazardly, as though it had dropped from the back of someone's truck. But someone should have noticed it. Something like that stood out like a dead animal on the side of the road. She became convinced that it had just dropped there, and maybe the owner would come back for it. Just as she thought that, a blue pickup truck thundered down the road, headed their way. Molly socked Sam in the arm, who dropped his phone to his side and watched the tornado of dust kicked up from the truck's tires. Sam thought about throwing up his hands to wave the driver down, but the truck had already slowed considerably to pull a U-turn and park next to them. A man stepped out, heavy-set and wearing what looked like pajama bottoms and a stretched-out t-shirt. A faded trucker hat sat perched on his nest of black, greasy hair. He was cleanly shaven, and his double chin shone smooth and bright in the sun. He looked genuinely concerned as he hitched up his pants and inspected their car. He noticed the spike strip before Sam could say anything and shook his head, making a clicking noise with his mouth. "You hit the jackpot there," the man said with a clear drawl to his voice. It sounded as though it was cut with sand. "This must have been left behind from the last police chase. Came by here the other day. Must have forgot about it." "A car chase, you said?" Sam asked. The man looked him in the eyes and smiled a mouthful of crooked teeth. "This ain't the city, and we don't see much high-speed news out here. But when it does, it gets around surely." "I would love to have the cop's badge number who left this here," Molly huffed. The man turned to look at her with bloodshot eyes, and he smiled even wider, which set Molly's skin to a crawl. "I'll make sure I look into that for you," he said. "I can give you a ride up the road, and we'll see who we can contact about that." "Thanks, but that won't work," Sam said. He put his hand up to silence any more outbursts from Molly. "We need to be somewhere by tonight, and all we're looking for is a motel or something. From there we can figure everything out, like sending someone back for the car. Unless you can change a tire, I'd be willing to pay you for your trouble." The man looked at the shredded tire and frowned. "Well, I might be able to help you there, but I'll have to come back with some tools. Why don't I take you up the road a little ways to a motel I know about? I have some friends who operate it, and this time of year the business is real slow. I'd like to take you there if that'll be all right. Before Sam could accept, Molly interjected, stealing the man's attention and his red, beady eyes. Doesn't get any business? Molly asked. In the summer? Well, it's off the beaten track a little ways in the woods, the man responded. Not the best spot to tell the truth, but the people who run it are fine folks. It gets its best business at Halloween, for sure. Why's that? Sam asked, suddenly interested. It's called the Red Motel, and it's a regular motel for most of the year, but at Halloween, they turn it into an honest-to-God haunted house. Scary fun, I tell you what, the man said with a hoot of laughter. I myself love to be scared. Makes you feel alive, it does. Chapter 2. The man introduced himself as Jerry Brills, and he gave them a much-appreciated lift to the Red Motel. Off the main road, as he had said, but close enough to town and the hospital to be a suitable place to settle in, Jerry dropped them off in front of a dilapidated building, and Molly couldn't tell if it was really in that bad of disrepair or if it was just Halloween theatrics. The place had a clear Bates feel to it, just small enough to include a walkway of 5 or 6 red doors, all standing faded and peeling of paint and devoid of any numbered markings. There were dead leaves decorating the roof like a woodsy crown of thorns, with a dirt cul-de-sac in front to park a car and a sign out front advertising, Hallows Eve thrills and chills, check into the Red Motel. The sign was just as faded, standing crooked in a stamp of grass out front. It looked to be splattered with red paint for added effect. The parking lot was empty, and Molly didn't think it was because the other guests were in town for the day. Jerry dropped them off and told them to meet Todd in the main office. He practically lived there, and Molly didn't think he was joking. Jerry would be back later that night, hopefully with the car fixed. Molly checked her watch impatiently, which did not go unseen by either Sam or Jerry. She promised to be there at her father's bedside before sunset. Jerry had only a couple hours to get the car ready, but he didn't look concerned. He waved to them as he backed out of the lot, and then the trees obscured him completely. They carried their bags up the main walkway, setting them down on the boards and entering the office through a screen door. It was just as small as Molly expected, just a counter with a door standing open behind. The notable smells of the office included some kind of spiced curry and wet mud. From the inner room, they could hear the distant muffle of a television program and a man laughing uproariously. Hello? Sam called, and the TV immediately silenced. They heard a chair creak as someone stood up. A tall man, skin and bones and a buzzed head, filled the space behind the counter and placed his large hands on the tabletop, smiling at them kindly. He wore coveralls, like something a mechanic would wear, and they were just as stained with grease and dirt. This surprised Molly, because she was convinced the grounds had seen zero maintenance in the last decade. He had a scruff of beard and wild flashing eyes, but he calmed Molly's nerves with a friendly greeting. Howdy, Todd said, looking back and forth between them. Welcome to the Red Motel. Don't let the sign fool you outside. We are a motel and have rooms to sleep. Overnight? Yes, Sam said, just for the night. Jerry sent us over here, and we'll be back later, hopefully with some good news about our car. Todd's face brightened even further at Sam's mention. Doggone Jerry, you said. I guess I can always rely on him for business. I think people are confused, thinking we're closed for all 11 months of the year. The man cut off to stare dreamily up at the ceiling. Oh, hell, did you say you had car trouble? Flat tire, Molly responded. Down the road. Bum trip, I know, he said, nodding. But you couldn't have a better man than Jerry for the job. He'll get you fixed up, and maybe we can have a game of cards in the back room later tonight. Jerry and a few others come by most nights for a hand or two. It keeps us busy, at least, and we try to get the guests participating if we can. We'll be busy tonight. If we can get our car working, Sam replied quickly. We have business in town, a family emergency. Molly's shoulders tensed at the sound of business. Is that what he thought they were doing? Molly thought it was more like punishment to have to watch her father die. Todd's expression softened. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, then we'll get you going as quick as we can. He reached under the counter and came out with a book, which he used to record Sam and Molly's name, as well as their room. He handed them their keys and told them it was the 5th room down the walkway. Excuse the mess, the man said. You think with all the downtime we'd get around to cleaning up after Halloween, but I think we like having the decorations around some. So you decorate the rooms, and people tour through them? Sam asked. Oh yeah, we deck each room out in a scary theme. He counted them off on his long fingers. There's the vault, the cave, the torture chamber. But the real show's underground. We chose this spot for a reason to build this building. A steel mill was here once, bulldozed, but there's a work and service elevator under our feet that opens up in some underground facilities. It's a real hoot, like a maze. I'd be happy to show you if you care to. No, we'll have to pass, Molly said curtly. Todd lost his smile and watched them turn around to leave. Well, I'll check up on you a little later, he said. Just holler. Outside, they picked up their bags and proceeded to the end of the walkway toward their room. Molly counted the doors as she passed, realizing how ridiculous it all was. When she stepped inside the room and flicked the switch on the wall, she was greeted with a numbing sight, enough to turn her stomach. Like the office, it was just as she expected. A television, a bed without its sheets, a nightstand, and an open bathroom. A fine layer of dust covered every known surface, and they left shoe prints in the stiff carpet. She expected she wouldn't be staying the night there, She would rather sleep in a chair in the hospital waiting room. She set her bags down as Sam closed the door behind them, sounding a sarcastic whistle. Molly called the hospital on her phone and learned there had been no change to her father's condition. He was coming in and out of drug sleep and was responsive but could not talk on the phone. Molly assured them she would be there in the next few hours and hung up with a strained face. She realized that she'd been holding her breath and she let it out slowly. Sam watched her, but without knowing how to comfort her, he walked into the bathroom. Molly sat on the bed, which did not give under her weight. She looked up and around, from her reflection on the TV screen to the hole in the ceiling. Sam stepped out of the bathroom to find Molly standing on the bed and inspecting the ceiling. "What are you doing?" "There's a camera in the ceiling," Molly snapped. Her hatred came out in a high rise to her tone. "No," Sam said with a laugh. He walked over and peered up with his neck craned. "There is a camera in the ceiling." "What the fuck?" she said. As she stepped off the bed, it slid sideways and Sam had to catch her from falling, and they both hit the wall. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer and bent down to inspect the floor. The bed had moved enough to reveal a piece of clothing, balled up in the corner. She reached to pick it up, but caught herself. It was a white shirt stained red with blood. Sam had to catch her again as she sprang back. "What the fuck is that?" she cried. Sam paused a moment, standing over it with his fists on his hips. "It must be a prop," he said. "This place is a haunted house at Halloween, Molly. It's classic Hollywood. Look, it's not even blood. It's too red." He picked it up with his thumb and forefinger, but quickly dropped it when he saw the frightened expression on his wife's face. "In the camera?" she asked. "Again, it's a haunted house." He reached out and touched her arms. "They probably have them for it." His features dropped doubtfully. "You're right. This is pretty creepy." "We need to get out of here," Molly said at a whisper, as if someone was listening. Sam nodded and they stepped out of the room with their bags. Outside they felt immediately safer, where they could fill their lungs with fresh air and listen to the cottonwood leaves in the wind. "I didn't get that guy's number," Sam said, staring hopelessly at his phone. "Do you think he fixed the tire by now?" "I think you should call AAA, Molly replied. "Tell them to tow our car and pick us up on the way." "Maybe I should just call a cab," Sam said. "We can find a better place in town, if we can get to the hospital first." He called a number for a taxi service and asked to be picked up as soon as possible. They watched their backs as they stood in the dirt lot, with one eye on the closed door to the office and one on the road. After 10 minutes of waiting, they heard a car approach the motel from the gravel road, and Molly's chest lifted. In the back of her mind, she knew it hadn't been long enough for a taxi. She was right. Another pickup truck turned the last bend, a lot like Jerry's, but older. It pulled up in a cloud of dust and two men stepped out. One wore a straw hat, which he tipped in their direction as they approached the main office. The man with the straw hat was young, but haggard in the face and red around his mouth and cheeks. The second man looked to be the same age, but he had shoulder-length white hair and a cowboy hat, complete with jeans and a pair of worn boots. He looked at Molly and Sam briefly, smiling toothlessly. They both walked into the office smoking cigarettes. Molly and Sam exchanged confused looks. Were they guests for the night, or were they friends with Todd? Molly knew the latter to be true when the three of them stepped out of the office, laughing and coughing. Todd patted them both on the backs and they stopped in place like puppets. "Glad to see you guys," Todd called to Molly and Sam. "These are my pals I was telling you about. We're about to deal a hand in here if you're interested." "No thanks," Sam said. "We're waiting for a cab. Like I said, we have business in town, and we really can't stay." "Wait inside here," the white-haired man said, still smiling. "It's getting cold out. The sun is setting now. You'll freeze yourselves." "We're fine out here," Molly said. She made no attempt at hiding her impatience. "We don't mind waiting." "Oh, hell. It'll take 2 hours for a cab to make it out here," the man with the straw hat said. "Let me take you into town in my truck if you want. I'll get you there in 10 minutes. "No, thank you. We'll wait for the cab," Sam replied. "We already called it." "Nonsense. I won't have you wasting your money on a cab when I got a perfectly good truck right there." The man approached his car, jingling his keys in his hand. "Really, we're fine waiting out here," Molly insisted. "No way am I letting you two nice folks stand out here and freeze," he replied shortly. "God knows those city taxis take their sweet time. You know they run up their clocks by driving slow. That's how they up their quota." "Why don't we just wait inside the office?" Sam said. "We'll stand by the door so we can hear the taxi when it comes up. Does that work?" Molly threw him a frightened look, which the man did not see. He smiled and shook Sam's hand. "My name's Daryl," he said. "That's my buddy Trevor. And we hear you already met Jerry." Molly couldn't believe what she was hearing. Word had spread fast about their flat tire. Apparently it was the talk of the town. "Hey, what about Jerry?" "You should have your car fixed up in a minute," Trevor said. "Yeah, why waste your money on a cab when Jerry's fixing up your ride?" Todd threw in. "We don't have time to wait," Sam started to say, but Todd cut him off. "Come on inside." Tom waved his hand at them. "Get in here and relax." Molly looked back at their room and wondered if it would be better to wait in there. The shiver up her spine quickly changed her mind and she followed her husband to the office, the last one to enter. The screen door clattered in the frame behind her. Inside the office, Molly and Sam stood in the door to the back room, where a table was set, and where the men sat around uncomfortably in folding chairs, much too small for them. A TV chattered in the background, forgotten for the time being. Now the room stunk of cigarette smoke and sweat. "Sure you don't want to get in on this?" Daryl asked Molly and Sam. He had taken off a straw hat to reveal a balding head of salt and pepper hair. Todd shuffled the cards and watched his guests in the doorway. "Yeah, come on. We could squeeze you two in." No, we'd rather watch, Sam said. Molly nodded without looking at them. Suit yourself, Tom belched and leaned over the table. Better the three of us. I have no quarrels with them, but you two owe me some scratch. After the last sorry game you played? Darryl laughed. I think I'll take what I owe off your tab. You sorry sons of bitches. Trevor shuffled the cards and started dealing with a quick hand. These two work the haunted house at Halloween, Todd said. Tell them what you do. I play a minotaur, with horns, Darryl said, touching the invisible horns above his head. It's pretty fun to chase people through the maze down there. The costume does all the work for me. I bet, Sam said. I can imagine. I haven't been to a haunted house in years, but I swore I'd never go to another. Why not? Trevor spat with real malice. He flicked the brim of his cowboy hat and peered up at him. What's wrong with haunted houses? Sam did a double take. Nothing. I meant nothing by it. They're just not for me. You don't like being scared or something? Sam blinked at him, struggling for a response. Take it easy, Todd said, punching Trevor in the shoulder. This did little to alleviate the situation because Trevor growled hatefully and shot Sam an ugly look. Molly stood stunned behind her husband, avoiding all eye contact. She was ready to spring at the screen door behind her and run into the forest if she needed to. She could only hope Sam was able to keep up. This guy is trying to say something, Darryl cut in. Go ahead, say it. I have nothing to say, Sam said with some energy, although he tried to keep calm. I'm sure you have a great haunted house here. I mean no disrespect. None taken, Todd said. Don't you worry about it. This place is our passion. We let the atmosphere do the work, if you know what I mean. You have to make the people think they're actually in danger. They need to believe that they may die, or else there's no fun in it. That's where you get the rush, like jumping out of a plane, or taking a real strong drug. Drink! Trevor suddenly cried, slamming his hand down on the table happily. He extracted a long glass bottle from underneath the table and showed it off to them as they cheered. The bottle didn't have a label, and the liquor inside was clear as water. The rest of the men hooted and clapped their shot glasses against the hard wood in a sporadic rhythm. Trevor poured them all a finger of the clear liquid, and they held fast to their glasses. All three of them looked at Molly and Sam expectantly, holding their drinks in the air in toast. Will you drink with us? Todd asked them. Trevor here is a fantastic cook. He's a natural-born chemist. I kid you not. He brewed this himself. Molly's insides turned. After the bottle was open, she almost gagged on the strong smell in the air, something like sulfur or ammonia. No, thank you. Sam spoke for the both of them. You don't want to try my drink? Trevor snapped. Sam almost screamed before they all laughed. He choked on his breath and looked around with a red face. I'm just kidding you. You don't need to try it. More for us. Molly relaxed her shoulders and looked outside, at a darkening sky and an empty lot. Besides, you don't need to actually drink it to feel it, Trevor continued. He lifted the bottle up, and cocking his arm back, he flicked the bottle through the air, but held onto it. It happened so fast, Molly and Sam flinched at the same moment. But what hit them was not the bottle as they expected. They were speckled with a spray of nauseous fluid that stung their skin and burned their nostrils. Both of them scrambled for the screen door as the men laughed behind them. They burst outside, but the cold air did little to soothe the burns on their skin. It actually made them worse, and the liquid dripped into Molly's eyes, turning her world into a bleeding painting of color, bright and phosphorescent. She screamed as her world turned upside down. She collapsed to the dirt next to her lifeless husband. With eyes rolling into her head, she saw stars. Chapter 3. Sam woke up with a splitting headache in the shadows of one of the motel rooms, at least from what he could tell. He lay in one of the two bunks on either side of the wall, and one was small enough for a child. He looked around, but the shelves, walls, and floors were bare. He stood up on swaying legs and reached for the door. He saw it was made of steel, like the door of a bank vault. It had a cold handle that wouldn't turn when he applied pressure. He pounded on the door and screamed for help. There was no reply from the other side, which only made him scream louder. He paused frequently to listen to the pained silence on the other side. Sam looked around, touched the walls, and found them to be just as cold as the door. He closed his eyes and told himself to wake up. Placing his back against the door, he gathered his thoughts. Okay, maybe this wasn't a dream, but where the hell was he? He tried to replay the events that led to his waking, but it was difficult to organize his thoughts. His head was heavy, as though he was drunk. He had to wake up. It was the only thing that made sense. He pinched himself harder and harder until the pain put tears to his eyes. This did nothing but further ground him in his body, rubbing the sore spot on his arm. He sat down on the bunk and rubbed knots into his hair. He could remember arriving at the Red Motel and paying for an awful room with a camera. Suddenly he could see the glass bottle in his mind, clear liquid and a pungent smell. The chemist had splattered them with water, and all he could remember was fire on his skin, like acid. Looking at his arms, they were dry and clean, and certainly not burned. His heartbeat intensified and the room would spin whenever he looked long enough at something. The vault was dark, and he thought it had to be nighttime. He still had enough light to see by, as if from a window, although the vault had no windows. Stranger still, there were no direct sources of light, not even from a light bulb in the ceiling, but he could still see in the dark. He heard someone cough, and he sprang up from his bunk. There was a small girl asleep in the bunk next to him, when it had been empty only a minute ago. Had he overlooked her? He didn't think that was possible, unless he was imagining her now. Sam closed his eyes tight and held his breath. When he looked back at the bunk, the girl was still there, lightly breathing with her back to him, and curled up under a thin blanket. Without thinking, he rushed over to shake the girl, but she remained asleep. He shook her, shouted in her ear, picked her up and dropped her back into the bed, but she slept through it all, lightly snoring through her nose. Sam returned to the door and banged on it a few more times with no luck. Where was he, and who was this girl? One of the men's daughters? One of their captors? He remembered the service elevator running underneath the motel, and wondered if he had accepted their invitation for a tour after all. Suddenly, the girl sat up in her bed with a robotic rigidity, staring at an empty space above his head. Sam watched as she stepped toward the door in her white nightgown, a teddy bear in her arms. "Hello?" Sam asked. He bent down to her height, level with her eyes. "What's your name, sweetie? What are you doing in here?" She looked straight through him and proceeded toward the door. She stopped inches from the handle and stood there, staring at the cold steel. Sam bounded to her side, waiting for her to open the door. Maybe she had a key, but she did nothing but stand there. He touched her shoulder and she turned around to face him, her teddy bear swinging. "My daddy told me not to talk to strangers," she said, and then turned back around. Her eyes had been so cold, her face expressionless. Sam didn't know how to react. He touched her again and she did the same profile turn. "My daddy told me not to talk to strangers," she repeated, and then went back to staring at the door. This was a nightmare. Sam backed away, the ground sloping down behind him. He leaned forward, trying to counterbalance the weight, but fell backward on top of the bunk. His head was spinning, eyes roving around in his head. There was no doubt in his mind they had drugged him. He couldn't even be sure the girl was really there, and when he looked up, she stood in the same place, out of focus and frozen still. Chapter 4. The floor seemed to drop out from under Molly as the elevator shuddered to a stop, jerking her out of her sleep. There was no way to tell what floor she was on, because there were no buttons in the elevator. The elevator had stopped, but the door in front of her remained closed. She shifted her weight around in her seat. Yes, a chair in the elevator was a strange concept, and so were the straps attached to the chair's legs and arms, bolted to the floor. Thankfully, she wasn't strapped in, and she sprang up from the cold seat. She stood up too fast and had to catch herself against the wall. She had a light head and a sinking feeling in her stomach, like she needed to throw up. Then she remembered the burns on her arms, but found nothing of suspect on her skin. She glared up at the flickering fluorescent above her head and experienced a sharp bolt of pain between her eyes. The door slid open slowly, and Molly was greeted with a cool breath of air, brushing like a tease over her face and arms. Then she saw the man lying face down in front of the elevator, and she choked back a scream. The man was not moving. He was large and bald, wearing white hospital robes. Molly remained frozen in place, with the elevator stalled and the door standing open. She managed to spring backward into the elevator with her weight braced against the wall. She looked down at the body, which she thought could stand up at any minute. The elevator started to shake and buzz, and she thought the doors might close on her again. She darted forward and leapt over the body, catching herself against an outside bureau. A vase of flowers almost toppled over, and she caught it. The flowers were fake. Molly took a moment to look around. She found herself in a short but wide hallway, curving around the corner and out of sight. There were 5 doors in front of her, 2 on either side and 1 at the end. A vast amount of light fixtures hung motionlessly from the ceiling. They were bulbous hanging creatures fixed to the ceiling by gold chains, and the bulbs were like fish bowls, filled with white light. The wallpaper was green and healthy, and the carpet under her feet was overly geometric with its interlacing orange and brown diamond patterns. A strong sensation of vertigo gripped her stomach, and she had to close her eyes as the floor swapped places with the ceiling. Molly could smell an odor on the air, like a woman's perfume, but undercut with the smell of vomit or spoiled food. She thought the air felt heavy, like a musty basement with no open windows, an earthy root cellar smell that clogged her senses. Once she had found her feet again, she hurried down the short extent of hallway, without bothering to open any of the doors. At the end of the hall, one of the doors was already open to reveal a room flickering with the shadows of 100 lit candles. The room wasn't wide, but it was long. An oriental carpet stretched out from her toes to an altar at the end of the room. On the altar, several tea candles burned around a stone basin. 2 men sat in the lotus position before the altar. Both wore gray uniforms, one of which looked to be wearing a straitjacket, and their postures differed. A bald man sat slumped over as if asleep, and the other man wore long white hair down his back. He turned to look at her, his face painted red, and a pair of plastic goggles stuck over his eyes. He smiled dark nicotine teeth. The other man did not stir. "Come inside," a dark voice said, and it exploded inside the shell. The very flames on the candles seemed to jump. The men did not move as the room swam with the tectonic shadows cast by an innumerable community of candles. The long-haired man turned around sharply on his butt and stretched his legs out. Molly screamed and ran down the hall. She entered an open space with museum-like displays encased behind glass on either side of her. The rooms were each decorated in Victorian style with bright pink or purple wallpaper and ornamental decor around the bed frames and picture windows. The rooms were too overwhelming to look at. The colors attacked her senses like flashing strobe lights. The last room was colored crimson red, from the drapery to the bed sheets. A body lay in the bed. She didn't need to stop running to recognize her father, dressed in a white nightgown and twitching slightly over the covers. How did they know about her father? How could they have created that scene for her to see? That was when she knew she was hallucinating, drugged by that clear liquid and absorbed in her skin. She fled through a passageway and into a hallway of mirrors, which was just as overwhelming, bumping and smacking into the glass. The mirrors shuddered in their frames, the entire room shaking. She caught a snapshot image of her reflection, mussed-up hair and a ghostly face, sweaty and pale in the light. She heard an animal grunt, and in the mirror she saw a figure moving behind her, a large man dressed in black fur. The figure hulked out of the shadows with red eyes and a dripping mouth. It had curved horns on its head. Molly screamed and ducked behind one of the mirrors, fumbling into a new room, set as a sterile laboratory of white light. There were burners hissing and glass pieces percolating with colored liquids. She found an exit to her left and sprinted into another room, stranger than the last. A large stove stood by the wall with smoking pans left unattended. A table was spread with an assortment of different foods, but it had been too long, and the trays were filled with rotting meats and buzzing flies. In the corner, an old man sat on a stool with a hot plate on his lap. He tried to heat up an antique spoon over a naked flame. He grinned like a madman and looked up at Molly as she entered the room. His eyes were crossed and yellow, and whether he even saw Molly, she couldn't tell. He tried to handle the spoon, but burned himself and howled with pain. The spoon clattered to the floor. She didn't wait long before running through another exit into a bathroom where dead mice lay in the sink. More food was left on the counter, rotting like compost on a moldy plate. Through another room she passed by a meat counter, an exact replica of a butcher's deli. A tip jar was displayed on the counter with a bright yellow smiley face on it. Severed fingers poked their nails out of the jar like breadsticks. Then she found herself in another hallway with a closed door straight ahead. She slammed into it with her shoulder and turned the knob. The door was painted red like all the rest of the doors at the motel, and she knew she was free. The door opened and she ran outside, clearing her head with some much-needed oxygen. She fell over on her hands and knees and scrambled through the dirt. Looking over her shoulder, she had just exited one of the motel rooms, the third door down. A boot crunched in front of her and she screamed. Jerry Briggs walked toward her from his pickup truck, now parked at the end of the lot. He looked concerned and hurried to help her up. She kicked dirt at him and tried to scramble away. "What's going on here?" he asked her. "Are you okay?" "Get away from me!" she screamed. Regaining her feet, she sprinted toward the trees. But something moved directly in front of her, sliding through the breaks in the branches, and it had horns. She stopped in her tracks as Jerry grabbed her from behind. He threw his arms around her in a bear hug and lifted her kicking and screaming in the air. "What are you doing out here when all the fun's in there?" Jerry said in her ear. He threw her to the ground and she immediately lost her breath. With saliva dripping from her mouth, she continued her stomach crawl through the dirt and gravel. The office door opened in front of her and Todd stepped out, cradling a shotgun in his arms. He pointed it directly into Molly's face and frowned at her in the moonlight. "You're going to have to get back in there," he said. "You paid for your time, and you're going to get your money's worth. I know you feel sick, but it's because you're resisting the drug. You got to let it work for you," Molly cried up at the sky. "Up we go," Jerry said, lifting her to her feet. She hung limp and suspended in his arms, refusing to move. The barrel of the shotgun followed her in a slow pan. "I took a look at your car," Jerry said behind her. She could feel his hot breath on the nape of her neck. "There's nothing I could do. It can't be fixed." "Please," Molly cried. "Please what?" Todd asked. "This show is just for you. Go on and enjoy it. Nothing's gonna hurt you in there. It's all pretend. Even this gun isn't real. Go ahead, look straight into the barrel and I'll pull the trigger. It's a fun game, don't you think? A gag. So you only think there's danger." He stepped closer so that the gun was inches from her face. Molly turned her head to the side, refusing to look at it. "We never hurt anyone," Jerry explained. "It's always the rooms that hurt them, not us." "Yes," Todd grinned. "The rooms always do that work. It's because I run the scariest haunted house in all America. Hell, the whole world. It's so scary people die of fright." "What, you don't think it's possible? Then step inside, little lady. Test your luck in the Red Motel. Check in and you won't want to check out." Jerry dragged Molly screaming toward the open door and back into the Red Motel. Chapter 5. Sam heard screaming behind the vault door, but he didn't know if it was his imagination or not. A woman screaming. "Molly!" He ran to the door, where the girl remained unmoving with her teddy bear. It was like a wild glitch in a video game, a ghostly apparition projected on the wall. Sam placed a hand on her shoulder just to make sure she was there, and his heart skipped when she turned her head to look at him. On the other side of the door, Molly screamed again. He banged his fists against the steel, calling her name. "I never get out of here either," the girl said suddenly. Sam spun around to look at her, but she was gone. Now she stood in the corner, blood dripping from her scalp. A shaking hand pointed at the space under her bunk. "He comes through here," she whispered. "That's how he got me." Sam cautiously crossed the room, expecting the girl to disappear again, but she did not move. He pushed the bunk aside with his foot. Outside, he heard a man laughing, and Molly cried in pain. He blinked his eyes, trying to adjust them in the dim light. Under the girl's bunk was a trapdoor with a brass handle. He attempted to yank it up, but it was locked shut. He turned around, but the girl was gone again, this time for good. He shook off the hallucination and gripped the handle a second time to try again. Then he stopped. He could hear rustling from the other side of the wall, followed by heavy footsteps on stairs, leading underground. Then a lock slid out of joint on the other side of the trapdoor. Sam stood upright, back arched against the wall. He was ready now for whatever he might see. The door creaked open and a head popped up. A red, dripping face appeared through the gap, looking around, and the man spotted Sam right as he kicked him in the nose. The trapdoor snapped shut and the man disappeared from view. Sam wrenched open the trapdoor and jumped feet first into the darkness. He felt his legs connect with something else, and the man screamed and fell silent. Sam realized that he had just knocked out Trevor, the man with the white hair. He was half naked, and he had fallen on his own weapon. It was a handheld sickle, like a farmer would use. He lay on his stomach, the blade protruding from his gut. Blood curled around Sam's heels in a quick drain. Sam looked up at a set of stairs and a light above his head. He ran straight at it and through a secret wall in the back of Todd's office. The poker table was just as he remembered. The folding chairs left scattered around the room helter-skelter. The TV in the corner flickered madly with a skipping image of a talking head. He burst through the door and around the corner, toward the screen door clacking in the wind. He peeked outside and spotted Todd on the front walkway with his back turned. In his hands he held a shotgun, and he was laughing. Somewhere Sam could hear Molly's muffled screams and the slamming of a door. Sam did not hesitate in bursting outside and pushing the man as hard as he could off the walkway. Todd did a faceplant in the dirt, the shotgun crunching under his ribs. He screamed as Sam landed on top of him, raining blows down on his head. Todd scrambled away, throwing Sam off his back with amazing strength. They both went for the gun, fighting over the stock and barrel. Sam had the stock end, and he wrapped his fingers around the trigger. "No!" Tom screamed before his face was reduced to a red crater. He fell back in a warm spray of blood and did not move again. At the sound of the gunshot, Jerry charged through one of the red doors, right into Sam's line of sight. Jerry shrieked and threw his hands in the air. "What are you doing? I just came back to return your car." "Where is she?" Sam demanded. He stood up on wobbly knees and pumped the shotgun. The shell casing dropped to the dirt between his feet. "Put the gun down," Jerry said. "If this is about your car, I can bring you to it. I changed the tire." "Shut up. Where is she?" "A few doors down." A few yards down, a door came open to reveal a large man in a fur costume clutching a thrashing Molly in his arms. He had a gloved hand over her mouth, a plastic headdress with horns sitting askew on his head. This was Daryl, the Minotaur. "Put the gun down or I snap her neck," Daryl growled with a voice unlike his own. As Sam shifted his focus from Jerry to Daryl, Jerry burst forward and collided with Sam, and the gun went off. The roof exploded in a shower of splinters right above Daryl and Molly's head. She slipped out of his hold, elbowing him hard in the chest. He grappled to hold onto her, but slipped and fell on his knees. She barreled straight into Jerry and dug her fingernails into his face. Jerry reached up to grab her with both hands while Sam punched him in the face. He fell off him in a faint. The Minotaur had claws, too, like razor-sharp barbs sewn into his gloves. He ran up and sank them into Molly's arms, bringing instant spurts of blood to the surface. Sam aimed the gun in his direction, but Daryl ducked at the right second, springing for the trees. Sam shot once more after him, but the darkness quickly swallowed the beast from sight. Molly nursed her bleeding arm with a tight grip and looked up at her husband with frightened eyes. "Can you run?" Sam asked her, and she nodded. "Then let's run." He helped her to her feet, and with the shotgun on his shoulder, they jogged to the end of the lot and found the road. A yellow taxicab stood isolated and dark, parked in the shrubs out of sight. They ran to the car and found it to be empty. Where the driver was, they didn't know. Perhaps he was still lost in the Red Motel, running through the countless halls and passageways without end. Sam opened the door, and the keys were still in the ignition. Sam inspected Molly's arm and touched her hair. "No more fucking around. I will get you to the hospital," he said. Shutting the doors and locking them immediately, Sam started the car, and Molly peered fretfully out the window, through her own reflection at the Red Motel, unlit in its circle of trees, where not even the moon dared to shine its light.